In the summer of 1878, in the small Georgia town of Millbrook, every single baby born at the new county hospital died within 7 days. Not one survived. Not even one. The town had waited 3 years for their first proper medical facility, built with donations from wealthy cotton merchants and blessed by the local preacher. Millbrook General Hospital was supposed to bring modern medicine to their rural community. Instead, it brought something else entirely. For 6 months, from June to November 1878, the hospital's maternity ward became a killing ground. 23 babies entered the world at Millbrook General. 23 tiny coffins left through the back door. The official cause of death was always the same: infant mortality syndrome. But the unofficial whispers told a different story, a story of poison, corruption, and medical horrors that would shock even hardened investigators. This is that story. Millbrook, Georgia, in 1878, was a town caught between two worlds. The Old South was dying, but the New South hadn't yet been born. Cotton fields stretched endlessly under the brutal summer sun, worked by sharecroppers who'd replaced the slaves but earned barely enough to survive. The town itself consisted of a main street lined with wooden storefronts, a white-painted church, and maybe 200 souls trying to make sense of a world that had changed too fast. Most folks lived in simple wooden houses with tin roofs that rattled when the afternoon thunderstorms rolled in from the west. But Millbrook had ambition. The town council, led by Mayor Jeremiah Blackwood, dreamed of progress. They wanted electric lights, paved roads, and most importantly, their own hospital. No more losing mothers and babies to dangerous trips to Atlanta when complications arose during childbirth. The hospital fund grew slowly. $5 from the general store owner, $10 from the cotton gin operator, $25 from the wealthy Ashford family who owned the largest plantation in the county. By 1875, they had enough to break ground. The building rose on Hill Street, the highest point in town. 2 stories of red brick with tall windows that caught the morning light. Local newspapers called it a beacon of modern medical practice and the finest hospital between Atlanta and Savannah. Dr. Cornelius Hartwell arrived from Savannah to run the facility. He came with impressive credentials: trained at the Medical College of Georgia, experience in battlefield surgery during the war, and letters of recommendation from prominent physicians across the state. But Dr. Hartwell brought something else with him, something the good people of Millbrook couldn't see in those carefully written letters of recommendation, something dark that would soon consume their dreams of progress. Dr. Cornelius Hartwell was a tall, thin man with pale eyes and hands that never seemed to stop moving. He spoke in a soft, educated voice that commanded respect in a town where most folks had never finished grammar school. At 42, he possessed the kind of quiet authority that made people trust him instantly. His medical bag was filled with the latest instruments: gleaming forceps, sharp scalpels, bottles of chloroform, and mysterious powders in labeled jars. He subscribed to medical journals from New York and Philadelphia and could discuss the latest surgical techniques with the confidence of a man who'd seen the world beyond Georgia's borders. But there were gaps in Dr. Hartwell's story, questions that nobody in Millbrook thought to ask. Why had he left Savannah so suddenly? His letters of recommendation were glowing, but they were also dated. The most recent one was from 1873, 5 years old when he arrived in Millbrook. What had he been doing in those missing years? The truth, had anyone bothered to investigate, was buried in the records of 3 different hospitals across Georgia and South Carolina, records of unusual infant mortality rates, records of investigations that had been quietly dropped, records of a doctor who moved from town to town, always just ahead of suspicion. Dr. Hartwell had perfected his technique over years of practice. He understood that rural hospitals offered perfect cover for his experiments. Poor record-keeping, grieving families who trusted medical authority, and communities that desperately wanted to believe in progress. He'd learned to choose his victims carefully, always newborns, whose deaths could be explained away as natural tragedy, always in places where he was the only qualified medical authority for miles, always in communities that couldn't afford to lose their only doctor, no matter what whispers might arise. Millbrook was perfect for his purposes, isolated, trusting, and desperate for modern medical care. The new hospital gave him complete control over births, deaths, and everything in between. But Dr. Hartwell had grown careless in his confidence. The pattern he'd established in other towns had worked so well that he had forgotten the most important rule of his dark profession: never kill them all. Millbrook General Hospital opened its doors on May 15, 1878. The dedication ceremony drew crowds from 3 counties. The mayor cut a red ribbon with golden scissors borrowed from the church. Dr. Hartwell gave a speech about bringing the latest medical advances to rural Georgia. Sarah Jenkins was the first expectant mother to trust her pregnancy to the new hospital. She was 19, married to a cotton farmer, and nervous about giving birth so far from her mother's experienced hands. But her husband Tom insisted they use the new facility. "Modern medicine," he told his wife. "That's the future." Sarah went into labor on June 3, 1878, just as the summer heat began to press down on Georgia like a heavy blanket. Dr. Hartwell attended the birth personally, assisted by 2 nurses he'd brought from Savannah. The delivery went smoothly. Sarah gave birth to a healthy boy they named William. For 3 days, everything seemed perfect. Baby William nursed well and slept peacefully in the hospital's new nursery. Sarah recovered quickly and looked forward to taking her son home. Then, on the morning of June 6th, William began to convulse. Dr. Hartwell examined the infant carefully, his pale eyes unreadable behind wire-rimmed glasses. He spoke in medical terms that Sarah didn't understand: acute digestive distress, infant nervous system failure, natural complications of premature development. William Jenkins died at 2:45 p.m. on June 6, 1878. He was 3 days old. Sarah wept for hours. Tom sat beside her bed, holding her hand and promising they'd have other children. Dr. Hartwell filled out the death certificate in his neat handwriting. Cause of death: infant mortality syndrome, natural causes. The funeral was held 2 days later. Half the town attended, offering condolences and praising Dr. Hartwell for doing everything possible to save the child. These things happen, they told each other. Even with modern medicine, sometimes God called the innocent home early. But in his private office that night, Dr. Hartwell made careful notes in a leather-bound journal. He recorded William's weight, feeding patterns, and most importantly, his response to the small doses of arsenic that had been added to the baby's formula over 3 days. The experiment was a success. The dosage was perfect, enough to kill, but not enough to cause obvious symptoms of poisoning. The timing was ideal. 3 days gave families hope before snatching it away, making the death feel more like natural tragedy than medical malpractice.
Dr. Hartwell was ready for his next test subject.
The second baby died 3 weeks later. Mary Catherine Ashford, born to the wealthy plantation family, lived for exactly 4 days before succumbing to what Dr. Hartwell termed congenital heart weakness. The Ashfords had the money and connections to demand a second opinion, but Dr. Hartwell convinced them that moving the failing infant would only hasten her death. He spoke with such authority, such apparent compassion, that they trusted his judgment completely. When Mary Catherine died, Dr. Hartwell personally comforted the grieving parents. He explained that infant mortality was tragically common, even in the best medical facilities. He quoted statistics from medical journals and shared stories of similar cases in Atlanta and Savannah. The Ashfords donated an additional $50 to the hospital in their daughter's memory. By August, 4 more babies had died at Millbrook General, all within a week of birth, all from apparently natural causes. Dr. Hartwell's reputation as a compassionate physician grew with each tragedy. He sat with grieving mothers, held their hands, and promised them that their babies had felt no pain. The town began to whisper, but not about Dr. Hartwell. They whispered about bad luck, about God's plan, about the curse that seemed to hang over their new hospital. Some of the older women suggested that maybe the building sat on cursed ground. Others wondered if they were being punished for their pride in trying to improve beyond their station. Nobody suspected their beloved doctor. Dr. Hartwell had chosen his poison carefully. Arsenic was readily available in rat poison and insecticides. In small doses, it caused symptoms that perfectly mimicked natural infant illnesses: digestive problems, weakness, convulsions, and finally death. Better yet, arsenic was nearly impossible to detect without specialized chemical testing that wasn't available in rural Georgia. The poison accumulated in the body over several days, allowing Dr. Hartwell to control exactly when each baby died. He varied his method slightly with each case. Sometimes he added the poison to formula. Sometimes he injected tiny amounts during routine medical procedures. Once, he soaked a baby's blanket in a diluted arsenic solution that was absorbed through the skin. Each death taught him something new about dosage, timing, and technique. Each grieving family validated his cover story about natural infant mortality. Each funeral reinforced his reputation as a caring physician who did everything possible to save his tiny patients. By September, Dr. Hartwell had perfected his system. He could predict with near-perfect accuracy exactly when each baby would die. He'd learned to time the deaths for maximum emotional impact, usually after giving families several days of hope. But perfection, as Dr. Hartwell would soon learn, could be its own downfall. Margaret O'Sullivan arrived in Millbrook on September 12, 1878, on the afternoon train from Atlanta. She carried a small leather satchel, a notebook, and a letter of introduction from the Georgia State Board of Health. Margaret was one of the first female medical investigators in the state. Trained as a nurse but educated in chemistry and forensic medicine, she specialized in cases involving suspicious deaths in rural hospitals. Her presence in Millbrook was supposed to be routine, a scheduled inspection to ensure the new hospital met state medical standards. But Margaret had done her research before arriving. She'd reviewed mortality statistics from hospitals across Georgia, and Millbrook's infant death rate was impossible to ignore. In just 4 months, they'd recorded more infant deaths than most hospitals saw in 2 years. Dr. Hartwell greeted Margaret with professional courtesy, but she noticed the slight tremor in his hands as he shook hers. He gave her a tour of the facility, proudly showing off the modern equipment and sterile procedures. He spoke confidently about medical advances and proper sanitation, but Margaret was trained to look beyond surface impressions. She noticed that the hospital's medicine storage room was kept locked, unusual for a facility this small. She observed that Dr. Hartwell personally supervised all infant feedings, also unusual for a chief physician. Most importantly, she noted the absence of detailed medical records for the babies who had died. "Dr. Hartwell," she said during their meeting in his office, "I've reviewed your mortality statistics. Your infant death rate is remarkably high for a modern facility." Dr. Hartwell's response was smooth and practiced. He spoke about the challenges of rural medicine, the poor nutrition of local mothers, and the genetic weaknesses common in isolated communities. He cited medical literature and shared anecdotes from other rural hospitals. But Margaret had heard similar explanations before, in other towns, from other doctors who'd turned out to be hiding deadly secrets. That evening, she began her real investigation. Margaret convinced the hospital administrator to let her observe night procedures, claiming she needed to assess 24-hour care standards for her report. Dr. Hartwell had no choice but to agree, though she noticed his obvious discomfort with the arrangement. On her first night of observation, September 13th, there were 2 newborns in the nursery: baby Thompson, born 3 days earlier, and baby Morrison, born just that morning. Both appeared healthy and were nursing normally. Margaret positioned herself at a desk in a corner where she could observe all activity while appearing to work on paperwork. She watched as Dr. Hartwell made his evening rounds, checking each baby with apparent care and concern. But something caught her attention during the 2 a.m. feeding. Dr. Hartwell personally prepared baby Thompson's formula, measuring ingredients from bottles he kept in his private medical bag rather than the hospital's general supply. When Margaret casually asked about this unusual procedure, he explained that the baby had digestive sensitivities requiring a special mixture. The explanation seemed reasonable, but Margaret's instincts told her otherwise. She'd investigated enough suspicious cases to recognize when doctors created unnecessary complications to justify unusual treatments. She decided to test her suspicions. During the 6 a.m. feeding, Margaret volunteered to help with the babies. She carefully observed as Dr. Hartwell again prepared a special formula for baby Thompson, noting exactly which bottles he used and in what order. She also managed to collect a small sample of the prepared formula in a testing vial she'd brought from Atlanta. Baby Thompson began showing symptoms later that morning: restlessness, digestive problems, and a slight fever. Dr. Hartwell diagnosed infant digestive syndrome and prescribed increased medical attention. He warned the Thompson family that the next 24 hours would be critical. Margaret knew she was watching a murder in progress. If you're finding this investigation as chilling as we are, drop a comment with your state. We love connecting with viewers who appreciate true crime mysteries. That afternoon, Margaret sent the formula sample to Atlanta via emergency telegraph, requesting immediate chemical analysis. She also began documenting everything she observed in detailed notes, building a case that could stand up in court. She had perhaps 36 hours before baby Thompson died, and Dr. Hartwell claimed another victim. The telegraph response from Atlanta arrived at 8:30 p.m. on September 14th. Sample contained significant arsenic concentration, sufficient to cause death in infant within 72 hours. Sending additional investigators immediately. Margaret stared at the telegram in the dim light of her hotel room. She'd suspected poison, but seeing the confirmation in black ink made her stomach turn. Dr. Hartwell wasn't just a negligent physician or an incompetent doctor. He was a serial killer who used his medical authority to murder helpless babies. But knowing the truth and proving it in court were 2 different challenges.
Margaret needed more evidence, and she needed to save baby Thompson before it was too late. She returned to the hospital that evening, claiming she needed to complete her overnight observations for the state report. Dr. Hartwell seemed more nervous than before, but he couldn't refuse a state inspector without raising suspicions. Margaret watched the 10 p.m. feeding carefully. Once again, Dr. Hartwell prepared a special formula for baby Thompson from his private supplies. But this time, Margaret was ready. She'd brought a small mirror from her hotel room, positioned strategically to reflect the preparation area. Using this clever setup, she could observe exactly which bottles Dr. Hartwell used while appearing to write in her notebook. She watched him add 3 drops of clear liquid from a small brown bottle to baby Thompson's formula. The brown bottle came from a locked compartment in Dr. Hartwell's medical bag, separate from his other supplies. After the feeding, he returned the bottle to its hiding place and locked the compartment with a small key he wore on his watch chain. Margaret needed that bottle. At 2 a.m., during the quiet period when the night nurse dozed at her station, Margaret made her move. Dr. Hartwell was in his private office, apparently sleeping in his chair, as he often did during night shifts. Using skills she'd learned during her training in forensic investigation, Margaret carefully picked the lock on Dr. Hartwell's medical bag. Inside the secret compartment, she found 3 small brown bottles. 2 were empty, but the third was half full of clear liquid that smelled faintly metallic. She carefully transferred a small amount to her testing vial, then relocked the compartment and returned to her observation post. Her heart pounded as she realized she'd just collected direct evidence of Dr. Hartwell's murder weapon. But her investigation had attracted attention. As she prepared to leave the hospital that morning, Dr. Hartwell cornered her in the hallway. "Miss O'Sullivan, I hope you're finding our facility meets all state standards. It would be unfortunate if any misunderstandings arose from your visit." The threat was subtle but clear. Dr. Hartwell suspected she was onto him, and he was warning her to back off. Margaret met his gaze steadily. "Dr. Hartwell, I always ensure my reports reflect exactly what I observe. Every detail gets documented." It was her turn to issue a warning. That afternoon, Margaret sent her second sample to Atlanta and requested immediate assistance from state authorities. But she knew help wouldn't arrive for at least 2 days, and baby Thompson was rapidly deteriorating. The infant showed all the signs she'd learned to recognize from her research on arsenic poisoning: severe digestive distress, muscle weakness, and episodes of convulsive shaking. Dr. Hartwell continued his charade of concerned medical care, adjusting treatments and consulting his medical books with theatrical gravity. The Thompson family maintained a bedside vigil, trusting completely in their doctor's expertise. Margaret watched Mrs. Thompson hold her dying son's hand and whisper lullabies, not knowing that the man they trusted to save their baby was actually killing him. Margaret faced an impossible choice. She could confront Dr. Hartwell immediately, but without backup from state authorities, he might simply deny everything and continue his murders in another town. She could wait for official help, but baby Thompson would certainly die. Or she could take a desperate gamble. That evening, Margaret approached Dr. Hartwell privately. "Doctor, I need to discuss some concerning findings in my report. Perhaps we could talk in your office." Dr. Hartwell's eyes narrowed, but he agreed. In his private office, surrounded by medical books and certificates, Margaret played her only card. "I know what you're doing to those babies. I have chemical evidence of arsenic in the formula, and I've documented your methods. The question is whether you want to save baby Thompson and leave town quietly, or whether you prefer to explain everything to a judge." For a moment, Dr. Hartwell's mask completely slipped. His face went pale, his hands trembled, and she saw the calculating killer behind the compassionate physician facade. "You have no idea what you're interfering with. These experiments are advancing medical science. I'm studying the effects of controlled toxicity on infant development. The knowledge gained will save thousands of lives." Margaret stared at him in horror. He actually believed he was conducting legitimate research, not committing murder. The depth of his delusion made him even more dangerous than she had realized. Those babies weren't research subjects. They were innocent children with families who loved them. And baby Thompson is going to survive this, even if I have to expose you publicly right now. Dr. Hartwell sat back in his chair, studying her with those pale, calculating eyes. After a long moment, he reached a decision. "Very well, Miss O'Sullivan. You've made your position clear. But understand this. If you try to destroy me, I'll take half this town down with my testimony. There are secrets in Millbrook that go far beyond infant mortality." It was another threat, but Margaret sensed something else in his voice. Desperation. Dr. Hartwell was more afraid of exposure than she had realized. What Margaret discovered next changed everything she thought she knew about Millbrook's tragedy. Late that night, as she searched through Dr. Hartwell's office files, she found a leather journal hidden behind a medical textbook. The journal contained detailed records of his experiments, but also correspondence with others who were involved in his work. The letters revealed a conspiracy that reached far beyond one murderous doctor. Mayor Jeremiah Blackwood had been receiving monthly payments from a medical research company in Philadelphia. The company was studying infant mortality rates and paying for unusual case studies from rural hospitals. Dr. Hartwell's systematic killing of babies wasn't just personal madness, it was profitable research. Hospital administrator Robert Hayes had been falsifying death certificates and medical records to hide the true scope of the deaths. He'd also been selling unclaimed baby bodies to the same Philadelphia company for anatomical research. Even more shocking, 3 prominent families in town had been paying Dr. Hartwell to ensure their babies died if they were born with obvious defects or disabilities. The Ashford family, whose daughter Mary Catherine had been perfectly healthy, had paid $50 to have her killed because she'd been born with a withered arm. Millbrook's new hospital wasn't just a medical facility. It was the center of a network trafficking in infant death for profit, research, and social control. Margaret realized she wasn't just investigating one killer. She'd uncovered a conspiracy involving the town's most respected citizens. The very people who'd trusted Dr. Hartwell with their children's lives had been complicit in turning the hospital into a murder factory.
But the journal revealed one more crucial detail. Dr. Hartwell was planning to leave town within days. He'd already arranged for a position at a hospital in Alabama, where he intended to continue his research. Margaret had run out of time. The next morning, September 16th, Margaret made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She couldn't wait for official authorities to arrive from Atlanta. She couldn't let Dr. Hartwell escape to kill more babies in Alabama. And she couldn't allow the conspiracy to continue claiming innocent lives. She decided to save baby Thompson herself, regardless of the consequences. Margaret waited until the morning feeding time when Dr. Hartwell would be preparing his poisoned formula. Instead of observing from her corner desk, she walked directly to the preparation area. "Dr. Hartwell," she announced, loudly enough for the nurses to hear, "I'm conducting a real-time inspection of formula preparation procedures. Please continue with your normal routine." Dr. Hartwell's face went rigid, but he couldn't refuse without creating a scene. Under Margaret's direct observation, he was forced to prepare baby Thompson's formula using only standard hospital supplies, not the poisoned mixture from his private stock. For the first time in 4 days, baby Thompson received uncontaminated food. But Dr. Hartwell wasn't finished. That afternoon, he approached Margaret with a different proposition. "Ms. O'Sullivan, I believe we've had some misunderstandings. Perhaps you'd join me for dinner this evening to discuss your report in a more collaborative atmosphere."
Margaret recognized the invitation for what it was. One final attempt to eliminate the threat she represented. Dr. Hartwell was planning to poison her, just as he'd poisoned 23 babies. But she also saw it as an opportunity to get the confession she needed to ensure he never killed again. "I'd be delighted, Dr. Hartwell. Shall we dine at the hotel restaurant at 7? That evening, Margaret took every precaution she could think of. She'd sent detailed letters to authorities in Atlanta, explaining everything she'd discovered and naming all the conspirators. She'd arranged for the hotel manager to check on her every 30 minutes during dinner. Most importantly, she'd brought a small vial of ipecac syrup to induce vomiting if she suspected poisoning. Dr. Hartwell arrived precisely on time, dressed in his best suit and carrying a bouquet of flowers. To any observer, he looked like a gentleman courting a lady, not a killer planning his next murder. The dinner conversation was surreal in its normalcy. Dr. Hartwell spoke eloquently about medical advances, shared amusing anecdotes from his training, and asked polite questions about Margaret's work with the State Health Board. Only his pale eyes betrayed the calculation behind his charming facade. The poison came with dessert. Dr. Hartwell had ordered a bottle of wine to accompany their meal, insisting it was a special vintage he'd been saving for an appropriate occasion. Margaret accepted one glass to avoid suspicion, but barely touched it throughout the evening. With the dessert course, the waiter brought coffee in delicate china cups. Dr. Hartwell made a show of adding sugar to both cups, stirring them carefully and sliding one across the table to Margaret. "To new friendships and mutual understanding," he toasted, raising his cup. Margaret lifted her cup and pretended to sip, but she could smell something faintly metallic in the coffee, the same scent she'd detected in his poison bottles. Dr. Hartwell had made his move. She continued the conversation normally, occasionally lifting the cup to her lips without actually drinking. Dr. Hartwell watched her carefully, waiting for the poison to take effect. As minutes passed without symptoms appearing, his casual demeanor began to crack. "Is the coffee not to your liking?" he asked, tension creeping into his voice. "It's quite good," Margaret replied, setting down the untouched cup. "But I'm afraid I must decline. You see, doctor, I know exactly what you've added to it." Dr. Hartwell's mask finally shattered completely. His pale eyes turned cold and predatory. His gentle voice became a harsh whisper. "You interfering witch. Do you have any idea what you've destroyed? Years of careful research, scientific advances that could revolutionize medicine, all ruined by some meddling woman who doesn't understand the greater good." "The greater good," Margaret's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. "You murdered 23 babies, innocent children whose only crime was being born in your hospital. How is that serving any good at all?" "Those deaths served science," Dr. Hartwell hissed. "I was studying the effects of controlled toxicity on infant development. The data I collected will help doctors save thousands of lives in the future. Sometimes a few must die so that many may live." Margaret stared at him in horror. Even confronted with his crimes, Dr. Hartwell genuinely believed he was a medical pioneer rather than a serial killer. The depth of his delusion made him more terrifying than simple cruelty would have been. "And what about baby Thompson?" she demanded. "What scientific purpose did his murder serve?" "Thompson was a control subject for my dosage calculations. I needed to confirm the lethal levels I'd established with previous subjects. His death would have validated my research methodology." Margaret felt physically sick. Dr. Hartwell spoke about murdering babies with the same clinical detachment he might use to discuss laboratory rats. In his twisted mind, the children weren't human beings, they were research materials. But she needed more than confession. She needed evidence that would convince a jury and ensure that justice was served. Dr. Hartwell realized his mistake immediately. His pale eyes darted around the restaurant, calculating his options. Margaret could see him considering whether he could kill her right there, in front of witnesses, and somehow escape justice. She made her own rapid calculation. The hotel manager was due to check on her in less than 5 minutes. The restaurant had several other diners who would witness any violence. Most importantly, she could see the evening train pulling into Millbrook Station through the restaurant window. The train that should be carrying state investigators from Atlanta. Dr. Hartwell, I believe your research days are over. Those men getting off the train right now are state investigators, and they have warrants for your arrest. It was a bluff. She couldn't actually see who was getting off the train from their distance, but it worked. Dr. Hartwell's face went white as he realized his situation was hopeless. Instead of fleeing or fighting, he made one final, desperate play.
Ms. O'Sullivan, you still don't understand the full scope of what's happening here. I'm not the only one involved. Mayor Blackwood, Administrator Hayes, several prominent families. They're all part of this network. If you destroy me, they'll simply find another doctor to continue the work. Margaret leaned forward intently. This was the confirmation she needed to bring down the entire conspiracy. Tell me about the others, Doctor. Help me understand how deep this goes. For the next 10 minutes, Dr. Hartwell revealed everything. The Philadelphia Medical Company that paid for infant mortality data, the mayor's role in covering up unusual death rates, the hospital administrator's falsification of records, the families who paid to have defective babies killed. He spoke with the desperate hope of someone trying to negotiate a reduced sentence by implicating co-conspirators. But Margaret knew that no cooperation could excuse the systematic murder of 23 babies. When the hotel manager arrived for his scheduled check, he found Margaret calmly taking notes while Dr. Hartwell talked compulsively about his crimes. She quietly asked the manager to send word to the train station that state investigators should come to the hotel immediately. 20 minutes later, Dr. Cornelius Hartwell was under arrest for multiple counts of first-degree murder. But the story of Millbrook's poisoned hospital was far from over. The state investigators who'd arrived on the evening train brought shocking news from Atlanta. Margaret's reports had triggered investigations at 3 other hospitals across Georgia and South Carolina, hospitals where Dr. Hartwell had worked before coming to Millbrook. The pattern was identical at each location: unusually high infant mortality rates, mysterious deaths that occurred exactly 3 to 7 days after birth, inadequate medical records, and missing death certificates. And in each case, Dr. Hartwell had left his position suddenly, just ahead of growing suspicions. Across 4 hospitals and 6 years, Dr. Hartwell had murdered at least 67 babies. But the Millbrook conspiracy proved to be even larger than Margaret had imagined. The Philadelphia Medical Company that paid for mortality data wasn't just collecting statistics. They were selling the information to life insurance companies, who used it to justify higher premiums in rural areas. Mayor Blackwood had received over $400 in payments for providing unusual case studies, enough money to buy a house in 1878.
He'd knowingly allowed Dr. Hartwell to continue killing babies because the monthly payments were helping him build a political career. Hospital Administrator Hayes had sold 17 infant bodies to medical schools, telling grieving families that the bodies had been respectfully buried while actually shipping them to anatomy classes in Atlanta and Philadelphia. Most shocking of all, 6 families had paid Dr. Hartwell to kill their own babies rather than raise children with disabilities or deformities. The payments ranged from $10 to the Ashford family's $50 fee for murdering perfectly healthy Mary Catherine, who'd only had a slightly withered arm. The investigation expanded to include postal inspectors tracking the mail fraud, federal marshals investigating the interstate transportation of bodies, and Atlanta detectives following the money trail back to Philadelphia. By October 1878, 14 people had been arrested in connection with the Millbrook Hospital murders. The scandal reached as far as the Georgia state legislature, where lawmakers demanded new regulations for rural hospitals and medical licensing. But for Margaret O'Sullivan, the victory felt hollow. 23 babies were still dead, and 67 more across multiple states would never grow up because she hadn't discovered Dr. Hartwell's pattern sooner. The only consolation was baby Thompson, who survived his arsenic poisoning and grew into a healthy child, never knowing how close he had come to becoming Dr. Hartwell's final victim. The trial of Dr. Cornelius Hartwell began on November 15, 1878, in the Fulton County Courthouse in Atlanta. The case had attracted national attention, with newspaper reporters traveling from as far as New York and Chicago to cover what journalists called the baby killer trial. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Samuel Morrison, presented a methodical case that left no doubt about Dr. Hartwell's guilt. They'd exhumed the bodies of 12 babies from Millbrook Cemetery, and chemical analysis confirmed arsenic poisoning in all 12 cases. Margaret O'Sullivan testified for 3 days, presenting her investigation findings, chemical evidence, and Dr. Hartwell's own recorded confessions. Her testimony was so compelling that several jurors were seen wiping tears from their eyes as she described watching baby Thompson slowly recover from arsenic poisoning. The defense attorney faced an impossible task. Dr. Hartwell's own research journal contained detailed records of his experiments, including calculations for lethal dosages and timing charts for maximum effectiveness. His confession at the hotel restaurant had been overheard by multiple witnesses. Instead of denying the crimes, the defense attempted to portray Dr. Hartwell as a brilliant but misguided researcher whose work would ultimately benefit medical science. They argued that his actions, while technically illegal, were motivated by a desire to advance human knowledge rather than personal gain. The strategy backfired spectacularly. The jury was horrified by testimony suggesting that murdering babies could ever be justified in the name of science. When Dr. Hartwell himself took the stand and spoke proudly about his groundbreaking research methodology, he sealed his own fate. The prosecution's closing argument was devastating. District Attorney Morrison held up photographs of each murdered baby while reading their names aloud. 23 names. 23 lives cut short by a man who'd sworn an oath to first do no harm. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. We, the jury, find the defendant, Dr. Cornelius Hartwell, guilty of murder in first degree on all 23 counts. Dr. Hartwell showed no emotion as the verdicts were read. His pale eyes remained fixed on some distant point, as if he were still calculating dosages and experimental variables, even as his world collapsed around him. Judge Harrison Watkins sentenced him to death by hanging, with the execution scheduled for January 15, 1879. But Dr. Hartwell would never face the gallows. On December 3, 1878, guards found Dr. Cornelius Hartwell dead in his cell at the Fulton County Jail. He was sitting upright at his small wooden table, his research journal open before him, his pen still clutched in his lifeless fingers. The final entry in his journal was dated December 2, 1878. Final experiment: self-administration of concentrated arsenic solution. Hypothesis: adult subject with my body weight should expire within 4 to 6 hours of ingestion. Beginning observations at 11:47 p.m. Even in death, Dr. Hartwell had treated himself as a research subject. The coroner determined that he'd somehow obtained a concentrated arsenic solution, probably by bribing a guard or extracting it from rat poison available in the jail. He'd consumed enough to kill 3 men, then spent his final hours documenting his own death symptoms with the same clinical detachment he'd used to murder 23 babies.
His suicide sheeted the gallows, but provided one final piece of evidence about his twisted mindset. To Dr. Cornelius Hartwell, every death, including his own, was simply data to be collected and analyzed. The other conspirators faced their own reckonings. Mayor Jeremiah Blackwood was sentenced to 20 years in prison for conspiracy to commit murder. Hospital Administrator Robert Hayes received 15 years for falsifying death certificates and trafficking in human remains. The 6 families who'd paid to have their babies killed were charged with conspiracy and sentenced to terms ranging from 5 to 10 years. The Philadelphia Medical Company that had paid for mortality data was shut down by federal investigators, and its executives faced charges for mail fraud and conspiracy. The insurance companies that had used the fraudulent data to justify higher premiums were forced to pay substantial damages to policyholders. But justice, such as it was, couldn't restore the lives that had been lost or heal the wounds that had been inflicted on an entire community. Millbrook, Georgia never recovered from the scandal of 1878. Families moved away, businesses closed, and the town's population dwindled as people sought to escape the shadow of the poisoned hospital. Millbrook General Hospital was closed permanently in November 1878, just 6 months after opening with such hope and ceremony. The building stood empty for 3 years before being torn down in 1881. Local residents said they could still smell the scent of death in its halls, though doctors explained this was psychologically impossible. The site where the hospital stood remained vacant for over 40 years. Children dared each other to walk across it at night, claiming they could hear the cries of murdered babies echoing from the empty lot. Adults crossed themselves when they passed and whispered prayers for the innocent souls who died there. Margaret O'Sullivan became something of a hero in medical investigation circles, but the Millbrook case haunted her for the rest of her career. She went on to investigate suspicious deaths at hospitals across the Southeast, uncovering 3 more cases of medical murder and saving countless lives. But she never forgot the 23 babies who died before she could save them. In her private journals, found after her death in 1923, she wrote, "I see their faces in every infant ward I visit. I hear their cries in every nursery I inspect. They died because I wasn't fast enough, smart enough, brave enough to stop their killer sooner." The families of the murdered babies struggled to rebuild their lives. Some moved away from Georgia entirely, seeking fresh starts in places where their tragedies weren't common knowledge. Others stayed in the area, but never spoke of their losses, carrying their grief in silence. Sarah Jenkins, who'd lost the first baby, William, went on to have 4 more children,
But she never trusted doctors completely again, and she insisted on attending every feeding and medical procedure her subsequent children received. Tom Jenkins later said that his wife aged 10 years in the months following William's murder. The Ashford family, whose daughter Mary Catherine had been killed despite their wealth and influence, became reclusive. They closed their plantation house and moved to Atlanta, where they lived quietly until their deaths. They never had another child. Baby Thompson, the child Margaret O'Sullivan had saved, grew up healthy and strong, but he carried invisible scars from his brush with death. As an adult, he would sometimes wake from nightmares about being unable to breathe, never knowing these were memory fragments from his arsenic poisoning as an infant. The Millbrook Hospital murders led to significant changes in medical regulation and hospital oversight across the United States. Georgia became the first state to require detailed medical records for all patient deaths, with independent review of any facility showing unusual mortality rates. Medical licensing requirements were strengthened, with mandatory background checks and verification of credentials from multiple sources. The practice of small-town hospitals hiring doctors based solely on recommendations was largely eliminated. But most importantly, the case established legal precedents for prosecuting medical professionals who abused their authority to harm patients. The concept of medical murder, using medical knowledge and access to commit premeditated killing, became recognized in legal circles across the country. But perhaps the most lasting impact was on public trust in rural healthcare. The Millbrook case shattered the assumption that doctors were inherently trustworthy simply because of their medical training. Families became more questioning, more involved in medical decisions, and more willing to seek second opinions. This increased scrutiny probably prevented similar cases from occurring, but it also created barriers between doctors and patients that persisted for generations. Rural physicians found themselves working harder to earn trust that was once automatically granted. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of infants and the elderly in medical settings. Advocacy groups formed to protect patients who couldn't protect themselves, and hospitals developed new protocols for monitoring vulnerable populations. Medical schools began teaching ethics courses that used the Hartwell case as an example of how scientific curiosity could become twisted into criminal behavior. Future doctors studied his research journals not for their scientific content, but as warnings about the importance of viewing patients as human beings rather than experimental subjects. Despite the thorough investigation and successful prosecution, some aspects of the Millbrook Hospital murders remained mysterious, questions that haunted investigators for decades and continue to puzzle historians today. How had Dr. Hartwell obtained his medical training and credentials? The Medical College of Georgia had no record of his attendance despite the diploma hanging in his office. His letters of recommendation proved to be forgeries, expertly crafted, but ultimately fraudulent. Who was Dr. Cornelius Hartwell? The name appeared in no birth records, census documents, or family registrations. Investigators suspected it was an assumed identity, but they never discovered his true name or background. He may have been a failed medical student who created a false identity, or perhaps a trained physician who'd committed similar crimes elsewhere under a different name. Where had he learned to use arsenic so precisely? His dosage calculations were remarkably accurate, suggesting extensive knowledge of the poison's effects on infant physiology. This level of expertise typically required years of study or experimentation, but no records existed of Dr. Hartwell conducting legitimate research on toxicology. Most disturbing of all, How many other victims had there been? The investigation covered 6 years and 4 hospitals, but Dr. Hartwell's techniques were so sophisticated that he'd clearly been perfecting them for much longer. Investigators suspected there were other hospitals, other towns, other clusters of infant deaths that had never been properly investigated. In 1923, a retired postal inspector claimed to have found evidence linking Dr. Hartwell to suspicious infant deaths in Tennessee and North Carolina, dating back to 1869. If true, his killing spree may have lasted nearly a decade and claimed over 100 victims. But by then, too many years had passed to verify the claims. Records had been lost, witnesses had died, and the physical evidence had long since been destroyed. The true scope of Dr. Hartwell's crimes would remain forever unknown. In 1925, nearly 50 years after the Millbrook murders, investigative journalist Thomas Whitman began researching the case for a book about medical crimes in American history. What he discovered added new layers to the mystery. Whitman found records of suspicious infant deaths at 7 additional hospitals across the Southeast, all dating from the 1860s and 1870s. The pattern was always the same: high infant mortality rates, deaths occurring 3 to 7 days after birth, and a mysterious doctor who left town just ahead of growing suspicions. The doctor used different names at each location: Dr. Charles Henderson in Tennessee, Dr. William Bradford in North Carolina, Dr. Samuel Morrison in South Carolina.
More chilling still, Whitman discovered that some of these earlier cases had been investigated by local authorities, but the investigations had been quietly dropped after the mysterious doctor disappeared. In 3 cases, the investigating officials had received substantial anonymous donations to their political campaigns shortly after closing the cases. Dr. Hartwell, or whatever his real name was, had clearly learned early in his career that money and political influence could protect him from consequences. The payments he'd received in Millbrook for his research may have been just the latest in a long pattern of buying protection through corruption. Whitman's research also revealed connections between the Philadelphia Medical Company and similar organizations in other major cities. These companies appeared to be part of a larger network trafficking in medical data, anatomical specimens, and research materials obtained through questionable means. The implications were staggering. The Millbrook Hospital murders of 1878 may not have been the work of one deranged doctor, but part of a systematic exploitation of rural medical facilities for profitable but illegal research. But Whitman's investigation ended abruptly in 1927 when he died in a suspicious house fire that destroyed all his research materials. Local authorities ruled it an accident, but colleagues suspected that his investigation had threatened powerful interests who preferred the truth to remain buried. The full story of America's most poisoned town would remain incomplete, with crucial questions forever unanswered. In 1930, the Atlanta Constitution published a series of interviews with survivors of the Millbrook Hospital scandal. Their testimonies provided haunting insights into how the tragedy had shaped their lives over 5 decades. Margaret O'Sullivan, then 73 years old, reflected on her role in exposing the murders. "People call me a hero, but heroes save everyone. I saved 1 baby out of 24. The other 23 haunt me every day. I wake up thinking about what I might have done differently, how I might have recognized the patterns sooner. She revealed that she'd continued investigating similar cases throughout her career, uncovering medical murders at hospitals in Florida, Alabama, and Mississippi. Dr. Hartwell wasn't unique. He was just the one who got caught. There are others out there using their medical authority to exploit and kill the most vulnerable patients. Sarah Jenkins, now 51 years old, spoke about the lasting impact of losing her first child. You never stop mourning a murdered baby. Every birthday that passes, every milestone my other children reached, I wondered what William would have been like at that age. The doctor didn't just kill my son, he stole our entire future with him. She also revealed that several families of murdered babies had formed an informal support network that continued for decades. We were the only ones who truly understood what each other had lost. We'd meet quietly, share memories of our babies, and try to make sense of why God had allowed such evil to touch our lives. Tom Jenkins, Sarah's husband, had a different perspective. I blamed myself for years. I was the one who insisted we use the new hospital instead of having the baby at home with the midwife like our parents did. I thought I was giving my family the best modern medicine had to offer. Instead, I delivered my son to his killer. The Thompson family, whose baby Margaret O'Sullivan had saved, spoke about living with the knowledge that their child had barely survived. We never told him the truth about what happened when he was born. How do you explain to a child that his first week of life was spent being slowly poisoned by the doctor who was supposed to protect him? But they also expressed gratitude that went beyond words. Miss O'Sullivan gave us back our son's life. Every day he's been with us. Every laugh, every achievement, every moment of joy, that's a gift she gave our family by being brave enough to stop that monster. By 1935, nearly 60 years after the hospital murders, Millbrook had begun to recover from its dark history. The population had stabilized around 300 residents, and new families had moved in who weren't connected to the original tragedy. A new doctor, Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, had opened a small clinic that served the community with compassion and competence. She was one of the first female physicians to practice in rural Georgia, and she'd chosen Millbrook specifically because of its history. "I wanted to help heal this town," she explained in a 1935 interview. "Communities can suffer trauma just like individuals can. Millbrook needed time to learn to trust medical care again, and I wanted to be part of that healing process." Dr. Morrison implemented unprecedented transparency in her practice. Families were welcome to observe any medical procedures. She maintained detailed records that were available for inspection by patients or their representatives. Most importantly, she never treated patients alone, always ensuring that a family member or community witness was present. Her approach slowly rebuilt trust between the community and medical care. Infant mortality rates dropped to normal levels, and families began choosing medical delivery over home births again. The specter of Dr. Hartwell's crimes gradually faded from daily concern. A new hospital was built in 1938, located on the opposite side of town from the old site. The building was designed with large windows and open layouts that emphasized transparency and community involvement in healthcare. The dedication ceremony was deliberately low-key, attended only by local residents rather than the politicians and dignitaries who'd celebrated the original hospital's opening. The inscription above the entrance simply read,
dedicated to the innocent lives lost and the healing of our community. But even as Millbrook moved forward, the town maintained memorials to the victims of 1878. A small garden was planted on the site of the original hospital, with 23 white roses, one for each murdered baby. A bronze plaque listed their names and birth dates, ensuring they would never be forgotten. Every year on June 6th, the anniversary of the first death, families gathered at the memorial garden for a brief service of remembrance. No speeches were made, no blame assigned. They simply stood together in silence, honoring the babies who died and the community that survived. The Millbrook Hospital murders of 1878 left a legacy that extended far beyond one small Georgia town. The case influenced medical practice, legal precedent, and public policy in ways that are still evident today. Medical education was fundamentally changed by the Hartwell case. Ethics courses became mandatory in medical schools across the country, with the Millbrook murders used as a primary example of how medical knowledge could be perverted for evil purposes. Future doctors learned that their oath to "first do no harm" wasn't just a guideline, it was a sacred trust that could never be violated.
Parents learned to ask questions about their children's treatment. Families began demanding second opinions for serious diagnoses. Patients started insisting on explanations of procedures and medications. The unquestioning trust in medical authority that had enabled Dr. Hartwell's crimes was replaced by healthy skepticism and active participation in healthcare decisions. This transformation wasn't without costs. Some qualified doctors found their work more difficult as patients questioned routine procedures and demanded extensive documentation. Rural areas sometimes struggled to attract physicians who were uncomfortable with increased scrutiny. But the benefits far outweighed these challenges. Informed, engaged patients were less vulnerable to abuse and exploitation. Medical errors decreased when procedures were subject to explanation and review. The quality of healthcare improved when doctors knew their decisions would be examined by educated, questioning families. Today, more than 140 years after the Millbrook Hospital murders, the case continues to resonate in modern healthcare and criminal justice. Medical ethicists still study Dr. Hartwell's crimes as an example of how scientific objectivity can become a mask for evil when it eliminates human empathy and moral consideration. Patient advocacy organizations trace their origins to the public outrage that followed the Millbrook revelations. The principle that vulnerable patients deserve special protection and that medical professionals must be held accountable for their actions remains central to healthcare regulation and legal oversight. Criminal profilers study the Hartwell case as an early example of medical serial killing. His method of using legitimate medical authority to commit murder while maintaining a facade of professional competence has unfortunately been replicated by other healthcare professionals who've abused their positions to harm patients. The case also provides important lessons about institutional failure and the dangers of unchecked authority. The conspiracy that enabled Dr. Hartwell's crimes involved respected community leaders, trusted institutions, and supposed oversight mechanisms. It demonstrated that evil can flourish when people assume that credentials, reputation, and social position guarantee moral behavior. Modern hospital safety protocols, informed consent procedures, and patient rights policies all trace their development back to cases like Millbrook. The transparency and accountability that patients expect today would have prevented Dr. Hartwell from committing his crimes, but only because previous generations learned through tragic experience the importance of questioning authority and demanding proof of trustworthiness. Share your thoughts on this investigation in the comments. What aspects of this case do you find most disturbing, and how do you think it connects to modern healthcare concerns?
The Children's Memorial Garden in Millbrook still exists today, maintained by volunteers who understand the importance of remembering tragic history rather than forgetting it. The 23 white roses bloom each spring, a reminder that innocent lives have value, and that communities must remain vigilant against those who would exploit trust and authority for evil purposes. In the end, the Millbrook Hospital murders represent both the darkest possibilities of medical authority and the power of individual courage to confront systemic evil. Margaret O'Sullivan's investigation saved not only baby Thompson, but potentially hundreds of future victims who would have died if Dr. Hartwell had been allowed to continue his crimes. But the case also reveals uncomfortable truths about human nature and institutional failure. Dr. Hartwell didn't operate alone. He was enabled by community leaders who prioritized profit over protection, by families who valued social conformity over their children's lives, and by a system that assumed credentials guaranteed character. The babies who died at Millbrook General Hospital were victims not just of one man's evil, but of a community's failure to question authority, demand accountability, and protect its most vulnerable members. Their deaths became meaningful only when they led to changes that prevented similar tragedies. Today, when we hear about medical scandals or institutional abuse, the lessons of Millbrook remain relevant. Evil often wears the mask of authority and respectability. Harm can be disguised as help. Exploitation can masquerade as expertise. And murder can hide behind medical credentials. The 23 babies who died in Millbrook's poisoned hospital deserve to be remembered not just as victims, but as catalysts for change. Their brief lives and tragic deaths created a legacy of improved patient protection, increased medical accountability, and enhanced public awareness that continues to save lives today. Their memorial garden serves as both a tribute to their innocence and a reminder of our responsibility to question, investigate, and act when we suspect that authority is being abused to harm the vulnerable. In their memory, we must remain vigilant against those who would use positions of trust to commit evil, and we must have the courage to act when we discover such abuse. The story of America's most poisoned town is ultimately a story about the price of trust betrayed and the power of truth revealed. It reminds us that eternal vigilance is not just the price of freedom, but the price of safety for those who cannot protect themselves. In the quiet Georgia town where it all began, white roses still bloom each spring, carrying forward the memory of 23 babies whose deaths changed American medicine forever. Their legacy lives on in every patient protection law, every ethics course, every moment when healthcare workers remember that their first duty is to do no harm. And somewhere in the records of that small-town tragedy lies a larger truth about human nature. That evil flourishes when good people assume someone else is watching, and that heroism sometimes consists simply of refusing to look away when others prefer to remain blind. The children of Millbrook are gone, but they are not forgotten. In their memory, we continue to watch, to question, and act when innocence needs protection from those who would abuse the sacred trust of healing. If this story has moved you as much as it moved us to research and tell, let us know what other dark chapters of medical history you'd like us to investigate. Your suggestions help guide our journey into the shadows where truth and justice intersect.